The Great Railroad Strike of 1877 by Lauren Harris, Atreyu Stewart, Sarah Brett, Jaylene Garcia, David Gonzalez Hernandez, and Wendy Young. In the late 19th century Midwest, working conditions of workers were unregulated and decided entirely by the owner of a given company. This resulted in many cases inhumane settings. People employed to build and work on railroads felt the full force of this lack of monitoring. The railroad workers were overworked and underpaid, having little time or funds for daily activities. The agitation of the workers led to what is today known as the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. As the first railroad strike in American history, the Great Railroad Strike of 1877 sparked a nationwide labor movement by demonstrating the freedom to revolt and protest and emphasizing the need for government regulation of businesses.
How it all began. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, established in 1827, was the first ever railroad company in the United States. From the early 1800s onwards, the railroad industry contributed significantly to the American economy, especially during the Civil War, 1861 to 1865. The railroads had access in Parkersburg, Virginia, Columbus, Ohio, Cincinnati, Ohio, and St. Louis, Missouri, which were useful for transporting Union soldiers. After the Civil War, the damages caused by the Confederate soldiers were repaired and the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Company expanded rapidly. Post-Reconstruction, industrialization quickly spread throughout the United States, with both skilled and unskilled workers required in large numbers to help maintain production in factories. Cities became heavily populated with workers, wages were very low, and their hours were long. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, for example, paid unskilled workers $10 a week for 10 hours or more per day.
In an interview with Bill Barry, he discusses John W. Garrett, the president of the B&O Railroad, and his cuts to the workers' wages.
He took advantage of what Naomi Klein calls the shock doctrine. And when the Depression of 1873 hit, he and a lot of the other railroad owners used that as an opportunity to cut wages. So what provoked the strike was the second 10% wage cut. And you will see...
This is the time when the railroad was making
money. Well, they were cutting back. There were some problems with the Depression, but he never cut executive salaries, never dropped a 10% dividend to the stockholders.
The Panic of 1873, also known as the Long Depression, is the name given to the downfall of the United States financial system, which lasted for 6 years. Those 6 years came with civil unrest, demonstrations, and the first nationwide strikes. It also led to many workers losing their jobs as railroad construction was heavily reduced, factories were closed, and businesses were eventually closed. With the economic depression, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad cut their workers' wages by 10% in 1877, thinking that their workers would accept the wage cut. Already suffering from a paycheck that could barely sustain themselves and their families, the workers decided to strike, refusing to work for the railroad company until their wages were restored.
The strike. The strike started July 16th. Word of their movement spread by word of mouth and news coverage. Many other workers began to join the strikes as their frustration was echoed. The striking workers received support from wide-ranging sources: striking boatmen on the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal, miners from Piedmont, West Virginia, and migrant workers in Cumberland, Maryland. Many impassioned speeches and rallying words were said during the strike, such as those of this man.
A man who works 14 hours can never be anything else but a downcast, ignorant man. If we become organized, we can carry on the great struggle successfully. Let us remember that we are the working classes of America.
The strikers were not restricted to harsh words on picket signs. They also uncoupled trains and refused to let them run out of the roundhouse. The strike spread like wildfire along the 2,700 miles of B&O line. It would then spread into Pennsylvania, Erie, Delaware, Chicago, and St. Louis, where similar scenes would then be repeated. It was not, however, completely well received among railroad workers, and many steered clear of the strike altogether. Even though the strike seemed to be going well, gaining more and more sympathizers, Colonel Charles Faulkner Jr. and his militiamen were brought in as part of an attempt by the B&O Railroad to end the revolt. The ending and fallout of the strike.
Violence broke out with the calling of the militiamen, state troops, and federal troops. Recounts of destruction and loss were displayed in newspapers, many of which demonized strikers.
On Saturday afternoon, an attempt was made to clear the blockade of the Pennsylvania Central line by force of arms, and a terrible slaughter followed. Over 30 people were killed and nearly 100 were wounded, many of them seriously. Infuriated by the massacre at 28th Street on Saturday afternoon, the crowd sought revenge not only on the Philadelphia soldiers, but also the Pennsylvania Railroad. From the latter, they secured an appalling revenge and the most fearful destruction of property, valued at many millions of dollars.
In each state, the strikers were broken violently, making casualties high. Though the first of these were seen as martyrs and catalysts for the cause, the threat of injury or death eventually put an end to the strikes, and the militia and federal troops were recalled.
After the strike, members of the militia that had shown sympathy for the strikers were dismissed. Many state militias were also restructured to be more capable of ending strikes in the future. While some workers were able to negotiate higher wages, the majority of the strikers saw no change immediately following the strike. Their pay was not raised, but their jobs were not in jeopardy. Strike leaders, however, were fired and blacklisted in the hopes of preventing them from starting another strike.
The labor movement. One of the more visible results of the Great Railroad Strike was the increased creation of unions and the beginning of the labor movement. Half a century after the strike, one of the leaders, Samvel Gompers, came forward, saying,
"The railroad strike of 1877 was the tocsin that sounded a ringing message of hope to us all."
In 1886, Samvel Gompers went on to be the first president of the American Federation of Labor. The American Federation of Labor is, to this day, the largest labor federation in the world. While this is the only union that resulted directly from the Great Railroad Strike, the increased awareness of labor issues that followed the strike influenced the creation of Labor Day in 1882, which got government recognition as a holiday in 1885. Following this was the creation of many unions, including the International Association of Machinists and Aerospace Workers, Sheet Metal Workers International Association, United Association, International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, and the Amalgamated Transit Union, all of which emerged between 1888 and 1892. It was also this unprecedented coming together of people that helped spark the Progressive Party, which worked towards fair hours and pay for workers. They showed America that they wanted change, and the Progressive Party later worked towards that change on a legislative level, with the regulation of business by government.
Due to the attention the labor movement was getting, along with the energy and support gained from the strike, it was able to accomplish a great deal. Many of the things they fought for are seen as common and obvious today, such as standard work hours or employers guaranteeing their workers' safety, though they were not direct results of the strike itself. It paved the way for the Railway Labor Act passed in 1926, which protected railway workers' rights to unionize and put a system into place to allow for a peaceful negotiation between workers and corporations about rates of pay, rules, or working conditions, and other legislation like it. Of course, some might argue, based on the amount of time that passed between the strike and some of the legislation, that the strike was not responsible for them. But the strike played a large role in advancing the labor movement and cannot be ignored as a factor. The strike resulted in long-term benefits that far exceed the original goals of the strike, and we experience many of them today. The Great Railroad Strike sparked a labor movement by showing the people the power of freedom of speech and the importance of coming together. It's an intrinsically democratic precedent of advocating for representation, without which American democracy would be lacking credibility in its founding goals. The Great Railroad Strike made a better America. Thanks for listening, and we hope you enjoyed.